The crisis in Gaza worsens with the Palestinian death toll now over 23,000. Hello, I'm Arnold Neidman. This is The Heat. The Gaza Health Ministry says the number of people killed in the enclave since the start of the conflict with Israel in October is now over 23,000. That includes 9,600 children. Meanwhile, Israel says it has begun a new phase of its operations in Gaza as it continues its efforts to eliminate Hamas. And fears of escalation rise after a Hezbollah commander was killed in southern Lebanon on Monday. We begin with that part of the story and this report from Beirut.
Hezbollah in Lebanon announced in a statement on Monday that its commander Wissam al-Tawil, known as Hajjawad, was assassinated in an Israeli missile attack that targeted his car in Khirbet Salem, 12 kilometers from the Lebanese-Israeli border. This is the first apparent Israeli targeting of a Hezbollah leader at this level. Tawil held a senior military position in the Military Operations Command in southern Lebanon. Israel has not commented on the attack. During the announcement, the central military media, Hezbollah's official media, published via its channel on Telegram pictures highlighting Tawil's status and importance, including pictures with the Secretary General of Hezbollah and Ahmad Mughniye aka Haj Radwan, who was also assassinated by Israel in a bombing of his car in Damascus in 2008. The elite Radwan forces are named after him. The pictures also included the slain commander of the Iranian Quds Force, Qasem Soleimani, killed by a US drone strike 4 years ago. Monday's strike comes 2 days after Hezbollah launched its largest operation against Israel since the July 2006 war, targeting Miran Air Base, the air coordination and control base in the north, as an initial response to the alleged assassination of the Hamas leader Saleh al-Arouri. Some experts say this latest assassination shows that the conflict in southern Lebanon is escalating, raising the level of violence in the region and the possibilities of continued expansion. Zahra Durzi, CGTN, Beirut.
To discuss all of this, I'm joined now by Dan Arbell. He is a scholar in residence with the Department of History at American University. Joining me here in the studio is political analyst Omar Baddar. With us too is Negar Mortazavi. She's a journalist, political analyst and senior fellow at the Center for International Policy. And joining us from Ontario, Canada, we are also joined by Michael Lynk. He is a former UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in the Palestinian territories. Welcome to all of you. Negar, let me start with that development in Lebanon. A senior Hezbollah commander was killed in that Israeli airstrike. What happens next? How precarious is this situation? Could we see a wider regional conflict which might involve Iran, Lebanon, and possibly the United States as well?
Well, I think this is the latest step in what we're seeing as limited escalations. There was also an assassination of the Hamas leader in the suburbs of Beirut. This is on Lebanese soil, Hamas leader. I think that is seen as an escalation by Hezbollah, by Iran. There was also the assassination of a top Iranian general, a top IRGC general in Syria. That goes into part of the bigger Israel-Iran shadow war that has been ongoing in that theater. I think from the Israeli side, the US side, the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, the situation in the Red Sea, skirmishes on the northern border between Israel and Hezbollah that's been continuing. These are all seen as each side, I think, would want to see them as limited and calculated strikes and does not want to see a big escalation, specifically the big players here, Iran, and as you mentioned, the United States. I don't think want an all-out regional war, but we may very well be heading that way with these steps and escalations that we've seen recently. And I'm honestly not sure at this point if the Israelis are not interested in an escalation or that opening of a northern front with Lebanon, which the U.S. has been warning them to not do. It seems like the Biden administration is, in fact, privately behind the scenes pushing the Israelis to not widen this conflict, but I'm just not sure if they're interested in not doing that.
Okay, Omar, let's look at the situation in Gaza. Great to have you in the studio, by the way, and let's look at the stark numbers that are coming out of Gaza. The health ministry in Gaza says the Palestinian death toll is now 23,000, as I'd mentioned, since Israel began its offensive. The UN says Gaza is uninhabitable and unlivable. Add to that widespread starvation and disease. I mean, how much more serious is this going to get?
Yeah, it's quite frankly clear at this point that I think it would be insane for anybody to deny the fact that Israel is targeting the civilian population in Gaza. They are the intended target of this war. All this talk about a war on Hamas in which Palestinian civilians are collateral damage is utter and complete nonsense. We've seen it in the statements of Israeli leaders who have used genocidal rhetoric to talk about Gaza. We've seen it in documents that have been revealed in 972 magazine that show that Israel is intending, from sources within the military, to create a shock by destroying huge parts of civil society. And we're seeing it in these actions. I mean, when you look at the extent of the devastation, 90% of the population already displaced, 60 to 70% of all infrastructure being utterly obliterated. And still with these kinds of restrictions on food and medicine going in, and a rate of killing of children, of journalists, of medics, of UN workers that we have not seen in any recent conflict in the past 20 years. I mean, this is absolutely a war on the Palestinian people. It is borderline genocidal violence. There's no question about it. And it's frankly the very reason why we're seeing this escalation taking place all over the region with these tensions rising everywhere. The possibility of this spreading into regional war is precisely because Israel is engaging in this genocidal violence and there seems to be nobody who's able to put a stop to it, that it's left to elements throughout the region to basically stand up for themselves and try to apply pressure on their own with very, very huge risks for regional escalation.
Dan Arbell, what is your response to that? I mean, we have heard these accusations often from many quarters that Israel is actually targeting Palestinian civilians in Gaza.
So, Anand, thank you. I think that there's a very simple way of ending this war. Hamas would just simply surrenders, raise the white flag. It started a war on October 7th, slaughtering 1,400 Israelis, raping women, beheading children. That led to Israel launching its attacks in the Gaza Strip. And so Israel is conducting surgical strikes and is hitting targets, primarily Hamas. And there are, unfortunately, citizens, innocent civilians that are being killed. But Israel's intention clearly is not to hurt innocent civilians. And so I think that the war is at this phase where it's going from a high intensity level to a lower intensity and more targeted operations. It's clearly not over, but certainly I reject all these allegations.
Yeah.
And again, numbers that you've mentioned at the start, 20, 23, 15,000, these are not real numbers. These are made up numbers by Hamas Health Ministry, not the health ministry of any real official entity. And so I don't accept these numbers either. And so it is regretful that citizens are losing their lives, innocent civilians, but certainly it's not a deliberate policy by Israel.
Right, these numbers, we do get them from the Ministry of Health in Gaza, and they have been accepted. I mean, in different conflicts, they have been accepted both by Israel and the United States, your main backer, Israel's main backer at that time. But if we just look at one of those numbers, Dan, 9,600 children in Gaza killed. I mean, is it not time for Israel to recognize what is going on here and enter into some kind of negotiations to secure the release of its hostages?
Again, I think this is a tragic unfolding of a result of this conflict. But again, this number of 9,000 children, I don't know where it's coming from, and I don't know whether it's reliable or not. Certainly, children should not be dying in a conflict, and innocent civilians as well. And I think that Israel set out very clear goals when it launched its operation, and these goals still need to be achieved.
Yeah.
And hostages need to be released. And certainly there are discussions behind the scenes trying to work out another ceasefire in return for hostage release effort. So hopefully that goes in that direction. Hopefully fighting will scale down in the coming weeks.
Well, those goals that you talk about, they appear to have changed, but I will get that to that in a moment. I want to get to Michael Lynk. Michael, another major development we've seen in the past few weeks is that South Africa is now accusing Israel of genocide, and it's bringing its case to the United Nations highest court, the International Court of Justice. In response, Israel has called this case, and I'm quoting here, slander, absurd and false, and the United States, through its spokesman, John Kirby, called it meritless, counterproductive, and without any basis in fact whatsoever. What are the grounds for this case, and does it have a chance of succeeding?
Well, let's start with what South Africa wound up delivering to the court. It was 84 pages of factual review of all that's gone on in Gaza over the last 3 months through Israel's military operations. This is an extraordinary document. As a lawyer, I read these sorts of documents all the time. It's rare that I come across something that is so well written, so well resourced, and so devastating in its compilation of facts. And part of these facts, of course, is the fire hose of genocidal statements, or genocidal-like statements, being made by Israeli political and military leaders over the last 3 months as well. This presents a high bar for Israel to want to answer. Israel usually ignores what goes on at the International Court of Justice with respect to Israel and Palestine. It ignores what goes on at the International Criminal Court, but it stated this time, last week indeed, that it's going to appear in the court later on this week. The proceedings are set for Thursday and Friday. South Africa will be setting out its case on Thursday. I believe that Israel will be responding on Friday. But any judge, any trained lawyer looking at this document will feel that Israel has a lot to answer for with respect to the deaths, with respect to the genocidal intent statements being made, and with respect to the devastation they would see every night on the screen. Judges are, after all, people who pay attention to what goes on in the world.
Yeah, Michael, just one point. When you say Israel has ignored decisions made by international courts before, if this court rules that Israel is in violation of the Genocide Convention, has indeed committed genocide, what are the legal obligations that Israel faces? I mean, this is not an advisory. It's a legal decision, right?
Yes, it is. It arises out of the fact that both South Africa and Israel are signatories to the 1948 Geneva Convention. And South Africa is arguing that it has standing in this case because it's a duty of every single signatory to the Genocide Convention, which is almost universally accepted, that everybody has a duty to prevent genocide or a genocide in the making. So legally, if the court is not going to make a finding of genocide. Let's keep this clear. This is a preliminary procedure. It's asking, what South Africa is asking for are provisional measures to demand that Israel stop what it's doing in Gaza. This is the equivalent in a domestic court of an injunction. So if the court does issue provisional measure orders, and it likely would happen by the end of this month, that Israel should stop what it's doing, then that is significant legally. Israel can presumably proceed to ignore this as it ignores other rulings. But politically, which is the more important arena, it would have a high case to answer in the public court and the diplomatic court for what winds up happening. And that's really what the hope would be here, that the United States would take the nudge coming from the court to push Israel to agree to a ceasefire.
Okay, let me bring Dan into this. Dan, as I said earlier on, there's been a fierce response from Israel to this action being taken by South Africa. In fact, Israel also called these charges despicable. What is your view of the action being taken by South Africa, and what are the arguments that Israel's going to make to defend itself?
I think it's totally ludicrous, this whole taking Israel to The Hague, to the ICJ. It's just a PR ploy trying to increase pressure on Israel. There's really taking quotes and messages by media pundits, by politicians on the fringes of the Israeli political system, by artists, journalists, and so on. Official Israeli policy clearly is against any genocidal actions. Israel is not carrying out genocidal policies. this is preposterous. And so it's a preliminary phase, and I hope that the court will reject this really silly lawsuit and just we'll be able to continue from there.
Omar, the other big questions being asked right now, even as the Israeli bombardment continues, is, I mean, there are considerable fears right now over what happens to Palestinians in Gaza. I mean, that is not just speculation. In fact, senior Israeli cabinet ministers are talking of a mass expulsion of Palestinians from Gaza. The Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, he's reportedly asked one of his top advisors to formulate plans to, quote, thin Gaza of its Palestinian population. We're talking here of over 2 million people.
Yeah, we are explicitly talking about ethnic cleansing. And I know that Dan has a very idealistic view of what Israel is as a country that respects international law and looks out for civilians. But this is not the time to indulge fantasies. It's time to deal with the reality that we're actually witnessing. And what we are witnessing is precisely this genocidal rhetoric that is talking about ethnic cleansing and the utter obliteration of Gaza day in and day out by prominent Israeli politicians. We're seeing with our own eyes the fact that Palestinian civilians are being sniped. We saw 2 children in Jenin, not even in Gaza, but in the West Bank, who were on the receiving end of Israeli gunshots, killed when they've clearly posed no threat. This is clearly a war on the Palestinian civilian population, and I think that this is very much Israel's aim, and we've seen it time and time again. We've seen it with the settlement expansion, where the world says we object to illegal settlements, you can't expand them. Israel says, yeah, sure, whatever you say, and then goes on building them. This is precisely what we're witnessing right now. You have a world consensus that opposes ethnic cleansing in Gaza, but it's quite clear that this is what Israel is actually driving towards. Right. The utter destruction of North Gaza, where people can't go back to where they live, the continued starvation of the entire population, allowing aid trucks to only trickle in, barely a fraction, with nearly every aid agency in the world saying they've never seen a humanitarian crisis on this level. Yeah. Clearly, they're making Gaza unlivable to drive Palestinians out.
Negar, how do you see this happening? I mean, what happens in the future? I mean, Israel, we've heard talk from Israeli ministers talking about pushing out the Palestinians into Egypt, into the Sinai Peninsula, into countries in Europe. France and Germany have been mentioned as well. What about countries like Egypt, like Jordan has also been mentioned? I mean, will they agree to this idea?
Well, I don't think so. So far, we haven't seen any indications, and this is not just in this period of time, in past periods of conflict. The idea has been floated. Jordan already is hosting a very large number of Palestinian refugees, other neighboring countries, Lebanon. But I don't think they're open to essentially allowing this ethnic cleansing of what's remained of this land. And let's also not forget, the population in Gaza is mostly already refugees from other lands that they've been drawn out of. And it doesn't seem like Egypt and Jordan or other neighboring Arab countries are very much open to this idea that the Israelis seem to be publicly pushing. Yeah. Even the United States, I want to point out, has publicly, Biden administration officials have publicly pushed back against this idea, essentially ethnic cleansing of the remainder of the land.
Right, Dan, we were talking earlier on about Israel's goals with the offensive in Gaza. It would appear to at least one part of the Israeli government that the goal is to expel all Palestinians from Gaza. We've heard this from ministers as well. But at the same time, we've also heard President Biden say that Israel should not do that. It should not permanently expel Palestinians. It should not permanently reoccupy Gaza as well. What is Israel's goal? Is that the goal, to expel all Palestinians and then claim Gaza as its own?
No, clearly not. There was a debate in the cabinet, but these ministers that have been proponents of this idea are on the far right, and they do not represent the overall other cabinet members, the prime minister and the war cabinet members. And so this is not an idea entertained in any way by the cabinet, by the war cabinet. And Israel's goals, as I've said in the beginning, are to deal a blow to the Hamas military infrastructure, to the political infrastructure, to target the Hamas leadership, and then obviously seek the release of the 135 Israeli hostages. Israel does not plan to reoccupy Gaza permanently, does not plan to establish settlements there. This is all just an idea entertained by the fringes in the Israeli political system and not really representing any broader consensus within the Israeli polity at all.
You say fringes, Dan. There was a piece in Politico which said that those fringes, those people that you're talking about, they hold real power. In fact, they are holding Prime Minister Netanyahu hostage to their beliefs.
Well, they do have power within the coalition, and obviously Netanyahu cannot get rid of them because he needs them for his coalition.
Okay.
But not getting rid of them is one thing, and listening to their ideas or adopting their ideas, their really extreme ideas is another. He's not doing it, and nor are the other war cabinet members.
Yeah. Michael Lynk, what are the legal ramifications of what we're talking about right now, the expulsion en masse of Palestinians from Gaza?
Well, of course, mass displacement and ethnic cleansing are certainly war crimes under the Geneva Convention and under international humanitarian law, also under international human rights law as well. And they would be elements in building the case, as you would see in reading the South African application for genocide as well. Remember, the definition of genocide is the destruction of a people in whole or in part. And one way of doing that is by killing, but it doesn't have to be killing alone or mass killing. It could also be the removal of people as well. And as you've indicated, and it certainly is laid out in the South African application and elsewhere as well, the number of statements going from the very top saying that thinning out the Palestinian population. The Minister of Finance talks about wanting to see no more than 100 or 200,000 Palestinians in Gaza. The Prime Minister, as you've indicated, is asking a number of countries, the Congo, Europe, North America, to find new homes for the Palestinians in Gaza. The former Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, who now is a part of the Likud party in the Knesset, writing op-eds saying that he wants to see a humanitarian response by the international community by taking the Palestinians in Gaza off Israel's hands. All of this builds the case both for war crimes as well as the allegation of genocide as well.
Omar, if we look at some of the diplomatic moves underway right now, very limited diplomatic moves, the United States Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, he's back in the region. In fact, he's just arrived in Israel. He'll be having what's been described as very difficult meetings with the Israeli government there. Do you expect his trip to make any difference?
I don't think it's going to make much difference because there's a fundamental broken dynamic with the United States, which is the U.S. has a lot of demands of Israel, and Israel does not care about any U.S. demands. And yet, American military funding and American diplomatic protection for Israel continues completely unabated. It's completely unconditional. And that's what fundamentally has to change. Netanyahu has no reason in weighing in this option between listening to his extremist partners in government or listening to the Biden administration. One group can actually have negative political consequences for him, while Biden has promised unconditional diplomatic, political, and military support no matter what Netanyahu does. So at the end of the day, there's very limited leverage until the U.S. government understands that the only way you're going to change the behavior of this apartheid occupation government is by applying meaningful pressure and saying that you're not going to receive any more military funding as long as your military is committing war crimes, as long as you insist on engaging in these kinds of acts, and denying Palestinians their fundamental right to live in freedom and dignity and having human rights. As long as that is Israeli policy, they should not receive another penny from U.S. taxpayers, and that's how you actually change Israeli behavior. Otherwise, everything Blinken is doing at this point is just a complete waste of time, and frankly, also utter hypocrisy. When you look at the rhetoric he has about Ukraine and Russia and the way he talks about Russian war crimes, and the far softer way he indulges Israel and its government's crimes, and talking about being friendly in the pressure he wants to apply.
Yeah. Dan, what is your view on this this visit by Secretary of State Antony Blinken to Israel? I mean, is he going to say the kinds of things to Israel that Omar was just outlining?
I think it's an important visit, and I think it comes at an important time. First of all, his main task, his main goal is trying to calm tensions along the Israeli-Lebanese border and avoid an extension of the war to the Lebanese front between Israel and Hezbollah, and trying to work out some diplomatic formula that will allow Israel and Hezbollah to not to engage in a full-scale war. So that's very important, and I think that the ground is ripe for doing so, as Negar suggested in the beginning. It's not clear whether this is going, but certainly there's no interest on either side to engage in a full-scale war. Second, on Gaza, I think he's going to clarify to Israel. I think that the administration's patience is running out. And I think Blinken is going to tell Netanyahu and other Israeli leaders that, you've got a few more weeks, but then, the U.S. is entering an election year, and U.S. patience is running out. And I think that he will.
I think Dan, I think the question that's being posed is, if indeed Secretary Blinken says you've got a few more weeks, then what? What happens?
In contradiction to what Omar said, I think that the Israeli leadership will listen very carefully what he has to say, and I think that what the U.S. message will be heard very well in Jerusalem. And I think that there will be impacting decision makers in Jerusalem.
Michael, when it comes to the kind of leverage that the United States has, what are the diplomatic measures that it can take using international law as a basis?
Well, the United States claims that it supports a rules-based international order. Indeed, it was the United States that was one of the principal architects of the post-war international legal framework that we now have. But the United States, I'll differ a little bit from Omar with respect to this. The United States does have enormous leverage over Israel with respect to the money it gives, particularly for military aid, and for the diplomatic shield that it provides Israel at the UN Security Council. It just chooses not to enter that. If you read the 2020 presidential memoirs of Barack Obama, he talked about the fact that whenever he had to make a difficult decision involving Israel, it created much more domestic blowback for him than whenever he had to make a difficult decision involving any of the other allies of the United States, such as Canada or Japan or England or France or Germany. So we always have to keep in mind the internal or domestic political dynamics in the United States when we talk about what the United States will do towards Israel. I mean, the United States, I think, will continue to support Israel publicly and politically, and therefore it will try to take all measures necessary to ensure there's no accountability in international law, either at the International Court of Justice or at the International Criminal Court.
I've got 20 seconds, very quickly.
Just very quickly, it's not much of a disagreement. The U.S. has enormous leverage, but the Biden administration lacks the spine to actually employ that leverage.
We are going to have to leave it there. Thank you to all of you for being with us. It's been a great discussion. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.
The nature of business is to bring value. Business activities in Europe, Asia, and the U.S. reach consumers globally. Trade, manufacturing, energy, high-tech, real estate, consumption. We give an expanded view on global business and how it covers, influences, or relates to the whole world. Global business, only on CGTN.